Hello, everyone. I'm Jayne Fisher. I'm a long-term member of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign Executive Committee, and I'm welcoming you to this online event today, called by the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign and kindly streamed online by the Arise Festival for Left Ideas volunteer team. And at this time, all our thoughts are with the people of Venezuela following the tragic earthquakes there in June. Currently, more than 5,000... Hello there, everyone. I'm Jayne Fisher, and I'm a long-term member of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign Executive Committee, welcoming you to this online event today, called by the VSC and kindly streamed online by the Arise Festival for Left Ideas volunteer team. And at this time, all of our thoughts are with the people of Venezuela following the tragic earthquakes there in June. And currently, there are more than 5,300 people confirmed to have died, and with the numbers still rising, and more than 16,500 people tragically have been injured as well. Now, last week, the World Bank released a report stating that the earthquakes that rocked Venezuela on the 24th of June caused $19.6 billion in direct physical damage, but we know that the cost of rebuilding could be much, much more than that. And today's event is a vital part of the ongoing work of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign in defence of Venezuela's national sovereignty and against all sanctions and interventions against the country, and not least the continuing theft of Venezuela's gold in the Bank of England. And it's quite simply a disgrace that over 30 tons of Venezuelan gold is still being held, despite the country repeatedly requesting its return. And there's over 1,000 sanctions still in place, mainly from the United States, on Venezuela, even now, in the horrific situation it finds itself. And so our message remains, following the illegal military attacks by the US against Venezuela in January, that campaigning is needed on the British government and others globally to join the many that have spoken out against the outrageous and violent kidnapping of President Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores earlier this year, and calling for their release. And so during the meeting, please do let us know where you're from, where you're tuning in from, in what's called the Q&A sections. Add your comments there. It'd be good to know what you think and your thoughts. Thank you for that. And the next speaker is going to be Kate Hudson. Kate is the Vice President of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, an officer of the Stop the War Coalition, and an executive member of the VSC. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Jayne, and big thanks to VSC for organising this very timely meeting. I think we all agree that ending the sanctions is absolutely urgent to save lives, livelihoods, and of course to defend Venezuela's national sovereignty. And I'd just like to start off by saying a little bit about the impact of sanctions on the peoples on which they're imposed and how other countries' experience of sanctions sheds light on US intentions today. Because there's no doubt that sanctions are a weapon of war whose primary and most devastating impact is on the civilian population. And of course, Venezuela is having this experience. This is something that we've been very aware of in the peace movement now for some decades, since the UN first imposed sanctions on Iraq in August 1990. I think many of us here this evening will remember reports of those terrible episodes. These sanctions lasted until the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, so that's 13 years of devastating sanctions. And they marked a new phase which was almost universal sanctions by the United Nations. And that had never happened before, because during the Cold War, it had been impossible to get a consensus at the UN Security Council. But in the unipolar post-Cold War world, the US could do pretty much what it wanted, including bullying and blackmail to get the votes in the UN. So, for example, when Yemen abstained on the Iraq sanctions vote, a US diplomat said to the Yemeni ambassador, "That will be the most expensive no vote you ever cast." And that was right, because 3 days later, the US cancelled £70 million worth of aid to Yemen. And of course, the same bullying and blackmail continues today, and it's often accompanied by unfounded political accusations to discredit national leaders, like narco-terrorism, for example, in the case of Venezuela. And the aim, of course, is always to destabilize governments that are non-compliant with US policies. US sanctions on Iraq prohibited the import and export of goods to and from Iraq, except for medicines and limited provision of foodstuffs. But in reality, all food imports were blocked, even though Iraq relied on imports for 70% of its food. It led to severe humanitarian distress, economic collapse, and the degradation of public infrastructure. Child and infant mortality soared. There was widespread malnutrition, a collapse of healthcare. Water purification just wasn't taking place, so there were epidemics of typhoid, cholera, and gastroenteritis. You can imagine the impact on the educational system and professional and scientific life across the country. In total, around 2 million people are understood to have died as a result of those sanctions. So that is what can happen with sanctions, and a clear reason why we have to continue vigorously to oppose the sanctions on Venezuela. So US sanctions on Iran, they've also been ongoing too. They began in 1979 after the revolution against the US-backed Shah. He'd actually been, of course, been put in power by a US-UK organised coup. The sanctions have been on, off ever since, but the clear intention there is to provoke regime change, causing intense economic hardship for ordinary citizens and leading to social unrest. So that is, again, we see that clear political intention with the sanctions as a form of warfare. Britain has participated in both Iraq and Iran sanctions. It hasn't supported the US comprehensive trade blockade of Cuba, but it's currently playing a very negative role with regard to Venezuela. It imposes sanctions on Venezuela in the form of an arms embargo, asset freezes, and travel bans. The most controversial element is the freeze on Venezuela's gold bullion, of course, one of our key campaigns to get that reversed. It was stored in London by the Venezuelan government in the 1980s, and it amounts to around 15% of Venezuela's foreign currency reserves. Its value in 2020 was around 1.4 billion. And as the price of gold has more than doubled since then, you can imagine how much more it will be worth. Since 2018, Venezuela has been blocked from repatriating the gold, according to John Bolton's memoirs at the request of the US. So once again, the British government is just going along with this illegal act at the behest of the United States. The UK government refuses to recognise the Venezuelan government and hand back the gold. Found a lovely quote from Yvette Cooper earlier in the year, saying that Britain wants to hold on to the gold, to use it as a weapon to push for a so-called transition to democracy. Well, okay, political games once again at the expense of a sovereign nation. Meanwhile, Venezuela is in desperate need of the assets to help rebuild and recover from the devastating earthquakes. And again, it comes down to the basic question. Total political and economic compliance is required by the sanctioning powers, Otherwise, they will continue to bleed countries dry to prepare them for regime change, eventually using military might if necessary. So our job, as ever, is to practically demonstrate our solidarity with Venezuela and to uphold their national sovereignty. Today, this means ending the sanctions and sending back the gold. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Kate, for that. And can I just apologise for the sound on the video earlier? Unfortunately, we had a few technical problems, and I think we're going to try and sort that out and play it again shortly. But first, and thanks very much to Kate. First of all, we are going to have a 1-minute message from Venezuela Solidarity Campaign volunteer Ben Hayes on how we can all help the campaign at this vital time. So I'm going to hand over to you, Ben, for that.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. This is just going to be a very quick summary of ways you can help to ensure the VSE is able to continue holding these events and do the various campaigning initiatives as we're here in this crucial period. As a starting point, if you're not already a VSE member, you'd like to join the campaign, there's a link in the chat where you can do just that. There's also a link where you can affiliate your trade union branch or organisation, which is another crucial source of support. There's also a model motion to help with that process as well. And additionally, if you're already a member and you'd like to make an extra donation, firstly, thank you very much. It's deeply appreciated. And secondly, there is a link in the chat where you can do that donation. Finally, one more link that is both quick and free. You can back the call for the Bank of England to return Venezuela's gold. It's being posted now. I think we've got over 14,000 signatures to that. See if we can get to 15,000 for starters. Thanks very much again for your support and for being here this evening.
It's great. Thank you very much, Ben, for that. So I think we're going to try now to play that video again from earlier from the campaigner María Páez Victor from Venezuela. So hopefully this will work now.
Hello. I'm María Páez Victor from the Louis Riel Bolivarian Circle of Toronto. Thank you for listening. On June 24th, Venezuela was hit by a rare and devastating natural phenomena, 2 powerful earthquakes with 39 seconds between them. This occurred 5 months after a political catastrophe, the bombing of the country and the kidnapping of its constitutional president, Nicolás Maduro, and his congresswoman wife, Cilia Flores, and the U.S. taking control of Venezuela's oil revenues. Venezuela is living now one of the darkest hours of its history. Its sovereignty is once again threatened by another murderous empire that tramples on international laws. A nuclear-powered nation used its most advanced cyber-technological weapons to cut off all communication channels and disarm the anti-missile units that the Venezuelans had acquired. 120 people were murdered. The president and his wife were kidnapped. She was beaten up by the dishonorable U.S. troops, injuring her face and breaking 2 ribs. This was a cowardly sneak attack of a tremendously unequal proportions. The nation was stunned. The Chavista leaders Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, Diosdado Cabello revealed that they were given 15 minutes to decide whether to cooperate with the United States or the bombing of the defenseless country would continue, and they personally would be killed outright. They accepted the terms of surrender because further bombing and deaths of civilians was unthinkable, and the nation would be left leaderless. Some blamed the victim and complained that Venezuela should have fought back. What exactly could the leaders have done? Fallen on their swords and accepted death, knowing that further destruction and deaths of civilians would follow? The technically disarmed Venezuelan army was not in conditions to take on the overwhelming power of the U.S. Many have seriously said that they should have gone in and gloriously immolated themselves, just like the charge of the Light Brigade, and just as futile, and left their people really orphans. The first duty of leaders is to protect their people. And that is exactly what the Chavista leadership did. The U.S. has taken control of the Venezuelan oil revenues that flow from the oil companies towards the U.S. This is what they've always wanted, the oil. Venezuela has to now go cap in hand to ask for some of their own oil money. It is nothing but gangster-like extortion at enormous proportions, obtained by threats to their presidential hostages, and worse, repeated continuous threats of further bombing. It has been 26 years of continuous U.S. sabotage, blackmail, economic war, mercenary incursions, cyber attacks, media demonization, theft. But the resilient, creative Venezuelan people resisted and prevailed. And Chavismo, the leaders of the Bolivarian Revolution, are strong, competent, popular government, and it transformed the national identity and the political culture. The U.S. has admitted that the only Chavismo can guarantee a government with order in Venezuela. But the empire will not win this deadly game because the Bolivarian Revolution cannot be erased so easily. It's not dead. It's not even dormant. One does not erase 26 years of the promotion of political consciousness, communitarianism, activism, transformative infrastructures grounded on the grassroots in a day or two, not even with military threats. So the situation with the U.S. is not stable. It's not even working. Chavismo is stronger than ever. The opposition has been pulverized by their own inhumanity. No regime change has occurred. Trump considers this a great military victory, like a big bully knocking down a smaller child. It is a hollow, inglorious, and shameful thing. He wanted to convert this vile attack into something grander, a Venezuelan model, a Maduro model. Such a cowardly attack should not be dignified with euphemisms that only attempt to give legitimacy, normalcy to what is only immoral, brutal force. It is no model at all. Just see how Trump tried to apply it to Iran, and where did that get him? The U.S. further attempted to manipulate the disastrous earthquakes to further control Venezuela. It did not go quite as planned. On the 24th of June, this double earthquake hit, and it was disastrous. 5,398 dead, 16,000 injured, 17,000 homeless, 856 buildings affected, of which 190 collapsed, 90% of whom were privately owned, and most were vacational apartments, not social public housing built by the government. But the emergency response of the Bolivarian government was immediate and overwhelming. And this is precisely what the U.S. supine media and international fascists have tried desperately to hide, to make invisible with its bots, AI, algorithms, and bot influencers. The first day, hours after the tragedy, 2,400 military were sent. By the end of the first week, it was 26,000 personnel of emergency services and military were there, plus 17,000 Venezuelan volunteers working. From the very first start, Venezuelan authorities have been the coordinators of over 4,000 international rescue team personnel and all the humanitarian aid. Not the U.S. It is Venezuela at the head of this reconstruction, of this rescue. And I will put up a slide so you can see everything that the Venezuelan has done. But I will stress that there are no mass graves. Every cadaver is given a decent burial and efforts made for identification. The rubble and debris is not being dumped into the sea, but transported inland to thus save marine ecosystems. Pets are being rescued. All this with much rainfall and 1,463 aftershocks that affect the rescue and create anxiety. Plus, 5 months income support for the homeless, housing support, rebuilding and relocation. No country in the world has had this with such promptitude. Compare this with the chaos of the Katrina disaster in New Orleans in 2005, where 2 years afterwards, the homeless and the dispossessed were still waiting. The entire communities black communities were drowned due to the government ineptitude. It was a true political scandal tinged with racism in the richest country in the world. In Venezuela, there was no undue chaos, no looting, no civil uprising. And to those that say that Venezuela has been colonized, the evidence shows that it has been Venezuelan authorities that took charge of the coordination of all humanitarian aid and all international rescue teams, working strictly on the terms set by Caracas. Even the U.S. rescue team had to bow their heads and accept this Venezuelan coordination. The U.S. sent 2,000 soldiers, unwanted and unasked, because they were preparing for a humanitarian invasion. But they failed absolutely for two main reasons. One, the fruits of 26 years of Bolivarian revolution. They did not find chaos, but order and everything under control of Delcy Rodriguez government, the Venezuelan military and services and organization. This was the triumph of the socialist government emergency planning, stable institutions of community belonging, popular organization, civic military union, of people who know their political capacity and have the lofty principles of solidarity. Those of us who study health and welfare of societies know that epidemics and natural disasters are best met by those societies that have what we call social determinants of health. And these are precisely what the Bolivarian Revolution has promoted in Venezuela: reduction of poverty and inequality, access to medical services free of charge, good public housing, effective public services, sanitation, potable water, transport, emergency planning and services, education and political awareness and active participation, community belonging and ties, PSU brigades, communes, communal councils, popular militia, solidarity, not individualism. And it is on this solid social and political grounds that Venezuela stands today. It is on the growing seeds of the Bolivarian socialist revolution that rescue and rebuilding is occurring. The second reason why the United States could not do a humanitarian invasion is that the whole world was there before them. More than 140 nations with international rescuers and humanitarian aid that was being flown in regardless of any sanctions. All this was there to be witnesses that Venezuela was not a failed state, that the rescue was being well coordinated. The U.S. was not coordinating the humanitarian aid. Venezuelan authorities were, and the Venezuelan army had taken full control of the worst area, which is La Guaira. And Delcy Rodriguez, the very first thing she did was appeal to the United Nations for help. And the first thing that Maduro did from his prison in Brooklyn was to call the BRICS and get the BRICS to help. So Venezuela is not isolated. True solidarity of many nations was evident and welcomed. Venezuela has not been recolonized as the Washington regime thinks. It is in a geopolitical tenuous situation, but there is a strategy and resistance, albeit under tremendous caution and silence. The Bolivarian leaders are not about to blab their plans to the press or to anyone who is just simply curious about it. Their silence is key to resistance and to survival. And this, you have to realize that the media is against Venezuela. No country in the world has to endure a catastrophe of this magnitude. And instead of being reported with sympathy and humanitarian respect, has been subject to vile, disgusting media barrage of innuendos and accusations. AI-generated false videos and plain lies about how the state institutions and the official services were coping, increasing people's anxiety and pain. The people The true solidarity with Venezuela today means the following: demanding the immediate release of President Maduro and his wife, the immediate cessation of all sanctions, the release of U.S. $22 billion worth of Venezuelan assets illegally robbed by the United States, the release of 31 tons of gold in the Bank of England illegally retained by the UK, and the removal of U.S. troops unwanted and unneeded in Venezuelan soil. As Hugo Chavez has said, for now, we give in so as to live and fight another day. The people of Venezuela are biding their time, knowing it is a waiting game, but they are prepared and they are ready. It is time not for criticisms, but for active international solidarity, if you believe in the Bolivarian Revolution. Venceremos, and thank you for listening.
Well, I think that was a very, very sobering, but also very encouraging message of resistance and resilience and determination, and also of solidarity. So we now move on, after hearing from Maria, to another video message from Venezuela. It's going to be an update from Fravia Marquez, who is both an advisor to Venezuela's National Assembly, but also a national spokesperson for the Cumbé Afro-Descendant movement. So we'll hear that next.
Distinguished colleagues and friends and representatives, it is an honor to address you today on behalf of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. We meet at a moment of great challenge, but also a moment that demand courage, solidarity, and justice. Our world continues to confront conflict, inequality, and economic pressure and natural disasters. In these circumstances, the international community needs to decide if they respond to division and punishment or helping the humanity. Venezuela is suffering the profound consequences of sanctions or unilateral coercive measures. These measures have affected not only the economic life, but the person itself. They have restricted financing, trade, technology, food, infrastructure, and essential resources for national development. Today, we welcome every step toward the full and conditional removal of these sanctions that have for years undermined the Venezuelan economic development and the wellness of their people. They have limited the opportunity for ordinary Venezuelans and disrupted the country's capacity to grow, produce, invest, and have better services for the public. It's a matter of justice, humanity, and respect for the sovereign rights of a nation to pursue their own path of development. Venezuela must be allowed to participate fully in the international community. This weakens institutions and imposes suffering in the population. Equally, we demand the return of the sovereign assets of Venezuela, like the gold that has been held abroad. This belongs to the Venezuelan people. We need it available to support economic recovery, strengthen the schools, promote national production, protect the vulnerable communities, and improve the quality of life of millions of Venezuela. No nation should be the price of their own resources, because all the nations have economic needs. This must be guided by international law, dialogue, mutual respect, and cooperation. The sustainable development cannot be sustained by collective punishment and isolation. It needs to be built by solidarity, partnership, and respect for the sovereignty of all peoples. At the same time, Venezuela has recently faced another difficult challenge, devastating consequences of a double earthquake. Families have lost their homes, communities have suffered damages, and all the citizens are facing the difficult task to rebuild their life in fear. Natural disasters remind us that humanity shares a common destiny. An earthquake does not distinguish between political or social classes. In moments like this, political differences must give way to compassion and international solidarity. The Venezuelan people have repeatedly demonstrated strong resilience and strong determination. We have faced enormous challenges, and we believe in social justice. But this resilience is not an excuse to leave the people alone in a moment of need. Recovery requires collective action. Government and international organizations, social movements, and solidarity networks, and the people of goodwill have their role to play in this. We call upon our friends around the world to continue standing with Venezuela, not only with words, but with concrete acts of solidarity. Every contribution, every partnership, every public statement, and every humanitarian initiative helps the strength of the recovery of our communities. We invite all that wish to support Venezuela to visit the webpage Venezuela no está sola. To this platform, solidarity movements and organizations can help and discover meaningful ways to contribute with the reconstruction of the Venezuelan people. This support is not charity, it's international solidarity. It is the recognition that no people should be abandoned because of political disagreements, economical disagreements, or geopolitical calculations. To support Venezuela today is to defend the principles of solidarity, social justice, and the right of all nations to determine their own future. And also to understand that humanity must be placed above any political conflict. Venezuela is always working to build community, and we believe another world is possible. The resources must be used to help people grow and not to bring more inequality or domination. So Venezuela is not alone, our people is not alone, and together to unity, justice, and solidarity, we will rebuild, recover, and move forward to our future with dignity and prosperity. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think that was another very powerful message there. And I think the call to continue to stand with Venezuela is more important than ever, and to defend their right to self-determination. And on that note, I'm going to move on now to Francisco Dominguez, Secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign and a leading campaigner on Latin America. Over to you, Francisco. It's always very important to hear from Francisco at meetings like these. So over to you, Francisco.
Thank you very much, Jayne. This meeting, I think, is, as all the meetings organized by VSC, are quite timely, especially now there is a new Prime Minister here. And we want to really impress very hard the situation, which is quite desperate, that Venezuela faces. I mean, everybody has talked about the sanctions, but I think we need some details of what they have meant in reality. Let me give you some figures. From 2012 to 2020, Venezuela's GDP, as a consequence of the sanctions, contracted by 74%. 88% of this contraction began in 2015 with Obama's sanctions. Before June 2026, 7.9 million people needed humanitarian assistance, according to the European Union Commission. 40% of Venezuelans face moderate to severe food insecurity. 56% of the population was in extreme poverty. Half of Venezuelan doctors and other health professionals left the country, including, as a consequence of the sanctions, 200,000 teachers. And between 2015 and 2020, there were more than 100,000 unnecessary deaths, with a very high proportion of children. This gives you an idea. It's even worse than that. If you keep examining the issue, it becomes worse and worse and worse the more you examine. I always make this point. I'm Chilean. The Pinochet dictatorship was considered one of the worst dictatorships in Latin America. In 17 years, assassinated 5,000 people. The Trump administration and the US imperialism, in about 4 years, killed deliberately, really deliberately, more than 100,000 people in about 4 years. And the intention was to actually punish the people so hard so that they either in despair, revolted, or just collapse. And they wanted to make the economy collapse, and the economy did not collapse. So this is quite an important dimension. And on top of everything, this is 26 years of destabilization, about 10 years of massive sanctions, 1,088 sanctions against Venezuela. Venezuela has been expelled from the international financial system. The situation was extremely bad. Because Venezuela was able to recover between 2021 to 2025, Venezuela actually reduced inflation from 1.5 million% to about 6%, single digits. The economy by 2025 was already growing by 8.5%. This is what led to the war fleet that Trump deployed in the Caribbean, 16 destroyers, 1 nuclear submarine, plenty of helicopters, F-35, military bases, plus the USS Gerald Ford, which is the biggest aircraft carrier in the history of humanity, to threaten Venezuela, killing loads of people in the process, small fishermen and so on, just to intimidate. Because Venezuela did not give in, they tried to go for decapitation. And they kidnapped the president and so on. Now, on top of all of this, Venezuela actually faced this double earthquake, which people have been talking about. More than 5,000 people have been died. About 1,000 buildings have been damaged. 190 of them have collapsed. The situation is quite desperate. And Venezuela happens to be the country in the world, because of the sanction, that has something like $20 billion retained illegally by financial institutions, including the gold that is retained over here. And according to the United Nations, the cost of reconstruction of the whole thing is going to be 37 trillion. Therefore, the more they return these resources which belong to Venezuela, and in the case of the gold, and I'll finish with this, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever, there is no moral reason, there is no political reason, and certainly no legal reason for the UK to continue to keep holding on to this. So therefore, we demand to the new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, that actually does the right thing, does the honorable thing, respect international law, and restore, the gold, the 31 tons of gold which belong to Venezuela. So please, we have a job to do. Sign the petition against the short trial of President Maduro, and support the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, which is the best one that is campaigning for Venezuela here in this country. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Francisco. And I think that that the fact that we have a new Prime Minister and a new government does give us a moment to even redouble our efforts to pressurise the government and to press for all of those demands that Francisco outlined there. Can I also say that we've got a really, really broad audience. We have people from all across this country and in Scotland and Wales. And we also have a further international audience from the United States, from Canada, from Ireland, and from Spain, from Belgium, and from Norway. So really, really good to have that spread of people. And thanks for the comments and for putting that in the chat as well there. So next, we're going to move on to a further video message from Venezuela. This time, we're going to hear from the trade union movement from Gerdul Gutierrez, who is the Secretary for International Relations at the CSBT Union Federation in Venezuela.
Un saludo solidario a la campaña de solidaridad de Venezuela en Gran Bretaña. A Francisco Dominguez, que nos hace esta invitación. Quiero agradecerle por siempre tenernos en consideración para expresar lo que estamos viviendo los venezolanos y venezolanas desde acá, desde nuestro territorio, desde nuestro pueblo. Después de unos acontecimientos bastante complicados, que fue el doble terremoto que afectó todo el eje costero de Venezuela, hoy vivimos un momento bastante duro que nos toca a todos los hermanos y hermanas de clase. Una afectación sin precedentes, más de 5.000 hermanos y hermanas fallecidos, algunos desaparecidos. Hoy, en medio de todo el levantamiento que se está haciendo muy responsablemente por el gobierno venezolano, porque siempre hay que enaltecer lo que se hace en positivo, lo que se hace bien. Y de verdad felicitar todo el esfuerzo hecho por nuestra protección civil, nuestros hermanos y hermanas de la Fuerza Armada Nacional Bolivariana, de todas las fuerzas que se desplegaron para socorrer en los momentos más críticos y duros. Igualmente agradecer a todos los rescatistas que vinieron a nuestro país, a todos los hermanos y hermanas que se hicieron presentes con sus equipos de rescate, con los animalitos, esos perros que bastante felicidad nos dieron a las familias venezolanas, porque bueno, los rescatistas caninos que de verdad nos quitamos el sombrero ante ellos. Igualmente, todo el esfuerzo que viene haciendo el pueblo venezolano, un grande gesto de solidaridad se levantó en todo nuestro país. Es importante destacar esto porque en los momentos de dificultad los hermanos y hermanas nos abrazamos para poder afrontar esta nueva situación. Una situación dura que ha querido los medios de comunicación internacional desacreditar el esfuerzo hecho por la presidenta Delcy Rodríguez, la presidenta encargada, y todo el gobierno revolucionario que hoy está al frente de todo lo que tiene que ver con la atención a nuestros hermanos y hermanas, a nuestros hermanos y hermanas que quedaron sin hogar, a los que los afectó duramente esta terrible situación, este doble terremoto, algo inédito en el mundo, y que bueno, nosotros lo afrontamos en medio de una situación bastante compleja. Las medidas coercitivas, el bloqueo y las sanciones han agravado que hoy tengamos que enfrentar una situación natural como esta con mucha más grandeza, porque continuamos en medio de un bloqueo sin precedentes, unas medidas coercitivas impuestas a nuestro país, sencillamente, bueno, porque les pareció al imperio norteamericano y se sentían amenazados por los venezolanos, que lo que sencillamente estamos es tratando de sacar adelante un país que ha sido duramente golpeado a nivel económico. Por eso hoy, bueno, nuestra campaña desde la Central Bolivariana, seguimos en la campaña mundial por el levantamiento total de las medidas coercitivas, las sanciones, el bloqueo, las mal llamadas sanciones, el bloqueo impuesto sobre nuestro país, sobre nuestra empresa PDVSA, nuestra principal industria, que siguen bajo las sanciones y que sencillamente siguen afectando duramente a la economía. En medio de esta situación, nosotros seguimos en la campaña mundial. Les pedimos a todos los hermanos y hermanas en el mundo que se hagan portavoces, porque el bloqueo y las medidas coercitivas contra Venezuela es un crimen de lesa humanidad. De verdad que no tiene otra forma de catalogarlo. Nosotros seguimos empeñados en llevar la verdad de Venezuela al mundo. Hoy siguen empresas confiscadas, sigue el oro en Gran Bretaña represado, y que es nuestro, son nuestros recursos, es nuestro oro, son nuestras cuentas, son nuestras empresas las que nos han quitado en medio de esta situación. Siempre nos vamos a hacer solidarios con la campaña por la libertad de nuestro presidente secuestrado, Nicolás Maduro, que bueno, hoy enfrenta una terrible situación que lamentablemente tenemos que verla hoy en el mundo. Desde acá de Venezuela, darles un saludo, un abrazo a la distancia, expresarles que seguimos en pleno trabajo hoy de tratar de reconstruir nuestros estados afectados. Los trabajadores y trabajadoras se han abocado, la Central Bolivariana se ha abocado directamente con nuestra federación en el estado de La Guaira y en los diferentes estados afectados, precisamente haciendo un levantamiento de cuánto y cuantificando la cantidad de trabajadores afectados, de puestos de empleo afectados, de situaciones para atender en el futuro de la reconstrucción por nuestro país. Agradecerles, compañeros y compañeras, de más está decirles, nosotros seguimos en pie de lucha, estamos tratando de solventar esta situación, pero siempre llevando la bandera de la verdad por nuestro país. Los medios de comunicación en el mundo mienten sobre todo lo que está ocurriendo en Venezuela. Por eso este tipo de encuentros sirve para llevar la verdad, para llevar la esperanza de lo que estamos haciendo, lo que todavía estamos trabajando por seguir fortaleciendo y construir el socialismo en nuestro país. Nosotros seguimos empeñados en eso, así nos enseñó Chávez, nos enseñó Bolívar y seguiremos en esa senda. Muchísimas gracias, compañeros y compañeras. Saludos en la distancia, agradecimiento a todo el equipo que hace posible esta conexión, a todos los hermanos de la campaña de solidaridad con Venezuela en Gran Bretaña. Saludos, hermanos y hermanas.
Okay, well, I think that was another really important message to hear. And here at VSC, we have always made sure that the trade union movement was an important part of bringing the message from Venezuela, and hearing from our trade union partners and colleagues in Venezuela is really important. Now, before I move on to what will be our final speaker, friends, and that will conclude the event, I mean, we have heard from a whole range of speakers the truth about what is happening in Venezuela and what campaigning we need to be doing against the murderous sanctions, and in particular for Venezuela to get its gold back from the Bank of England. So just to reiterate what has been said and what's been put in the chat and what has been said by other speakers and earlier, we really hope that you will join the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign on the link provided. This is probably the absolute key way that you can be part of the solidarity movement. Share and sign the petition for the gold to be returned. We need to get that up to 15,000 signatures at least, and we need you to be lobbying your MP on the issue of the gold on the link provided. And also there have been links provided where people can donate as well on the earthquake, and that's been put in the chat too, because I know people were asking about that. Now, for the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign does a huge amount of work with volunteers, and for an organisation with a very small budget, any support on that front that can be given makes a real difference. So I'm now going to hand over to our final speaker, who is Jeremy Corbyn MP, founder of the Peace and Justice Project, who have been doing some much appreciated events and campaigning on Venezuela, and a long-term campaigner for so many important causes in Latin America, on solidarity with Palestine and across the world. So delighted to hand over to Jeremy now as our final speaker.
Thank you, Jayne. Can you all hear me? Good. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you very much for mentioning the Peace and Justice Project, which we've just produced this book, the Gaza Tribunal, Britain's Complicity in Genocide, which is the verbatim account and commentary on the event that we held after the government had refused to debate my bill on setting up a public inquiry into their activities on genocide. The book is now on sale generally, and I hope you'll get it and use it as an example of how we do our best to put pressure on the political system in Britain, because that really is what we can do in solidarity with people internationally. Venezuela is going through the cosh big time, and it really goes back to the very clear declaration by Donald Trump last November with the US security strategy, which was produced by him and the State Department, and it quite clearly said it was a reiteration of the Monroe Doctrine, in that they give themselves the right to intervene anywhere they wish in the Western Hemisphere, for which they mean Latin America and the Caribbean and Mexico and Canada. And they also give themselves the right to intervene anywhere else in the world where they think US interests are at risk, without ever defining what those interests are. And also that they said that where there are any hostile foreign influences at work in the Western Hemisphere, they reserve the right to intervene. They don't say what these hostile foreign elements would be, but I think we can all guess about it. And so they went in on this basis, killed people, grabbed the president and Maduro, and he's now still in prison in the USA, and put an enormous pressure and enormous threats on Venezuela. So Venezuela, from being a place that was able to freely give acts of solidarity to other countries such as Cuba, is now very much under the cosh of the US, with the constant threat of a complete and overt invasion. And so this is a threat all across Latin America, and it's a political threat that's being carried out wherever they can by getting right-wing governments in post in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Chile, and they already have a right-wing government in office in Argentina, and be very prepared for the degree of interference that will happen in the presidential election in Brazil that's coming up. And so we've got to be very well aware of all of this. It's not all new. This has happened many times before, but nevertheless, the progressive forces and movements have managed to survive these eras of oppression. And it's also a question of linking up with our friends and comrades in the United States, and a very interesting discussion with a delegation of people from the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, who are over in Britain. I think they're going back tomorrow, I believe. Very interesting discussion with some of them last night. And so there is the need for international solidarity, which is so important. But it's also about what the British government's view on this is. The British government's formal position on Cuba has always been recognition of Cuba ever since the revolution of 1959. That has not been a problem. What has been a problem is the practicality of solidarity and not really challenging the Helms-Burton Act, which makes it illegal under US law for any company that's also registered in the USA to trade with Cuba. And this obviously has a very chilling effect on the Cuban economy. Venezuela was able to help Cuba a great deal by the supply of oil, and Cuba's current position is perilous, to say the least, with very little oil getting through, big increase in solar, but it's not anywhere near enough to compensate for the loss of all imported oil, which would keep the Cuban electricity generators going. And so the solidarity of the Venezuelan people has never been in doubt, but the practicality of that solidarity with US warships preventing any oil getting to Cuba is very obvious and very serious indeed. But what we also have to ask of the British government is this, that they've had a very odd relationship with Venezuela. They've maintained ambassadorial level arrangements with Venezuela throughout. Yet at the same time, they recognize the non-elected, unofficial government of the opposition in Venezuela, at the same time as keeping an embassy in Caracas and also having a Venezuelan ambassador in Britain. I think we need to be very clear with the British government exactly what they are recognizing and who they're working with. And then crucially, the participation in the sanctions by the refusal, as Jayne was saying, to release the money that is the gold that's being held by Britain, which is properly belongs to Venezuela. That's never been that it properly belongs to Venezuela. We've had debates on it in Parliament going back 10 years and more. And I remember it being very clear on a number of occasions, all parties in Parliament actually agreeing that the gold belongs in Venezuela, but the Treasury were never prepared to sign it off, presumably under pressure from the State Department and the Treasury in Britain. So I think we need to renew that demand, and we will continue to do that. What we also have to look at is the wider context of the direction in which the world is going. We're in solidarity with Venezuela because we want to see social justice. We want to see revolution that brings about real hope and opportunities for the poorest people to get education, health, housing, and food, all the basics of life. The US another agenda is about empowering the world's global corporations to an even greater extent than they're empowered at the present time, and that is what the US overall strategy is about. But it's also about spending huge amounts of money on arms and weapons. And we now have the appalling situation that every one of the world's power blocks, China, Russia, India, Europe, USA, are all spending astronomical sums of money on a new generation of weapons. We have wars going on in Ukraine. We have wars going on, obviously, for the Palestinian people who are being devastated by the genocide in Gaza. And we have the wars in Sudan and the DRC. We have less money than ever available for the United Nations and any peace agencies around the world, and less money being spent on overseas aid. In other words, all we're doing is rearming the whole planet at a time when there's obviously enormous environmental challenges that can only be met by investment in sustainable renewable energy and protection and expansion of existing levels of biodiversity. None of that is being done whilst we're spending, going up this year to $3 trillion on arms, and therefore the promotion of more wars in order to get more cheap natural resources from Latin America, from Africa, wherever else it happens to be. So our solidarity with Venezuela is about to get the US sanctions off their backs, to end the sanctions regime and allow Venezuela to trade freely in the world. It's also about releasing President Maduro, who was wholly illegally arrested and put on trial in the USA, as our contribution to saying that if international law means anything, then it means that you cannot go and arrest a head of state, whoever that head of state is, because that would be totally contrary to international law. So our solidarity is important, and our recognition that Latin America whole history has been one of throwing off the yoke of Spanish colonial possessionry, and British as well come to that. Then the independence period of the 19th century, which then coincided with the Monroe Doctrine, in which, in a sense, that controlled the levels of independence in every place. The countries that have thrown off that yoke, historically, have been Chile under Allende, have been Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro, have been Cuba ever since 1959, been Nicaragua and other places as well, and other countries at various times. And so our solidarity with those that want to see a liberation of Latin America, so the people of Latin America, in all their diversity, in all their linguistic abilities and differences, and can realize the benefits of their own natural resources and not be the back garden of the United States. And so our solidarity with Venezuela and the British government, send the gold back to where it belongs, to allow the people of Venezuela to clean up after the earthquake, to repair the buildings and educate their children, and give the people of Venezuela the decent life chances that they so richly deserve, not taken away by the theft of resources and the keeping of the gold.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thanks to everyone for joining this evening, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you at the next thing. Bye.
Thanks, Jayne.
Thank you, Jayne. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I'm sorry I was a bit unprepared. I hadn't heard any of the other speeches, so I just rushed on.